Good morning and welcome to Election Watch. I'm John Fortier, a senior fellow here at AEI, joined by my co-fellow, Chris Steyerwalt, and we are here on the 40th anniversary of the beginning of the longest running election program in history in Washington. And this program has long roots here at AEI, and I think you're familiar, some of you, from the very beginning. We are going to continue to have the same sort of significant and serious analysis of elections, both elections and their consequences. And we're going to do so in ways that are familiar to you, but we're making a bit of a new start. We have, of course, a familiar lineup that many of you know, that I've been sort of a junior partner, been part of this for 20 years. Carlin Bowman was one of our original founders in 1982, along with Norm Ornstein. Many of you know Michael Barone also, and Henry Olson, who's joined us. We are going to be changing the lineup a bit, but also maintaining some continuity. Chris and I are going to moderate. We're going to bring in some new guests. We have some really interesting people today. We're going to rotate those guests, but we're also going to bring back Carlin, Norm, Michael, Henry as well. So I think you'll see some continuity, but an era where we're going forward on a new venture to still talk seriously about elections, but be here in the way that looks a little bit different. I'm going to begin by just giving you some basic information. We've got a room here full of people who might want to ask questions, and there will be an opportunity toward the end of the program to ask questions. There also is an opportunity to ask questions from our virtual audience, and that would be, you could email samantha.goldstein@aei.org or on Twitter with the hashtag AEI Election Watch. With that, I'm going to turn it to Chris Steyerwalt to introduce our panelists and to begin, and then we'll look forward to you joining our program.
Well, John overruled me. I wanted to include a monster truck pull portion in this going forward, mud wrestling. This was shot down also, so we'll just do what we can. I am really grateful for you all getting up early. I hope you are finding delicious food to eat and having a good time today. We're so glad that you would be with us and take time. This is special to me because the work that AEI does on politics is special to me because it's different than much of what happens. It's not about point scoring. It's not about grubby grinding. It's about the health of the republic, and it's about strong institutions and a country that works, and that matters a great deal to me. So thank you for being here, and thank you for caring about that. Okay, people you should know. People you probably already know. Carlin Bowman is a distinguished senior fellow emeritus at the American Enterprise Institute. As John said, she helped launch this in she helped launch AEI's work on public opinion, period. But in 1982, she was one of the founders of this program. She continues to analyze American public opinion using available polling data on a variety of subjects, including the economy, the presidency, the environment, and global warming, and women's attitudes. She is the author of many extensive AEI public opinion studies, which I have robbed blind. I have stolen from my analysis over and over again. I should be jailed. She has spoken about the evolution of American politics because of key demographic and geographic changes. She's going to talk to us some about that today. She's lectured on the role of think tanks in the United States. She received the Warren Matofsky Award for Excellence in Public Opinion Research. Which is one of the most prestigious honors in public opinion. And she went to Wisconsin, so go Badgers if that's how you get down. Bill McInturff is the foremost Republican pollster in America, certainly the most esteemed. And the firm that he founded, Public Opinion Strategies, is sort of the gold standard. It's the Cadillac. When Cadillacs were good, it's the Cadillac of Republican polling firms. It's a big deal. He and his firm have had speaking of gold standards, one of the best public opinion polls they did for a long time with NBC News and the Wall Street Journal. Then the Wall Street Journal replaced them with Donald Trump's pollster, and it's not as good anymore. But anyway, it's still, Bill and his firm still work with Hart Research, Hart Research, to do the same poll for NBC, and it is a great asset to us because it's been good for a long time. So when we need to compare stuff over time, it is incredibly useful. Under his leadership, Public Opinion Strategies has done a bunch of stuff. 19 senators and 50 congressmen, not bad. That's a whole caucus right there. 30 successful initiative campaigns over the past decade, a 30-year career in survey research, 5,000 projects. He's a big deal, and a baseball fan, even if he has the wrong allegiances. Mo Alethi is the founding executive director of Georgetown's Institute of Politics and Public Service. Mo is a friend of mine and one of the clearest-eyed Democrats on what's going on in his party and what's going on between the parties, what's going on with Republicans. Mo is really good because he paid his dues all the way down. Let's get it all in. Senate, gubernatorial, statewide, local races, coast to coast. He was. And I first met Mo, I think, when you were the comms director and senior spokesman for the DNC. I think that's probably when or maybe even when you were in Virginia. He was the senior spokesman and traveling press secretary for Hillary Clinton's 2008 campaign, senior advisor and strategist Tim Kaine's gubernatorial and Senate races. He was a founding partner of Hilltop Public Solutions, a leading political consulting and public opinion firms. Not surprisingly, he went to Georgetown, so he has gone home to mama.
Play a saxophone.
There you go. So you should listen to what these people have to say. How we're going to do this today, just so you know, we're going to go through. We are at the crossroads. The Georgia primary that's coming up next week is the Super Bowl of the primaries, right? We have the Brian Kemp gubernatorial showdown, which Donald Trump laid down as his big marker, is coming up in a week. The Pennsylvania Senate election, which was a huge test, is still unresolved. So I'm having flashbacks to 2020 as I'm watching Allegheny count votes and looking for people in Yinzer sweatshirts, and I'm for that. But we want to go down the line here to get started for a little framing before we get into the areas of expertise of the individual panelists and just get a sense of how it's going. So Mo, let's start with you. Where are we? As Admiral Stockdale would have said, where are we and why are we here?
Thanks for having me. I'm a little intimidated being on this stage with such big brains, but I'll try not to disappoint. Look, I think it's going to be a messy remainder of the cycle. The primaries have, if you think of politics as sport, this is your cycle. If you care about the health of the republic, it's a messy one. But I also think that a lot of the conventional wisdom might be thrown out the door because of the messiness. I think it is likely that for all of the reasons that I suspect we're going to talk about today, that given the president's approval rating, given the high rate of inflation, given a number of other factors that have been building for the past several years, it's going to be hard for Democrats to hold the House. I think the Senate's a bit of a jump ball, though. And when you look at how some of these primaries are playing out around the country, I think it underscores how much of a jump ball it is. I would not be surprised if at the end of this cycle, the status quo actually wins. Maybe the House flips, but on the backs of a lot of close races around the country, and the Senate could be 50-50, it could be 51-49 in either direction. That's not a prediction, because after Donald Trump was elected, I stopped making predictions. But it is, I think, a scenario that we should all seriously consider.
Bill, what do you think?
Well, first, I just want to congratulate Carlin for 40 years and the work you've done. As somebody who does, of course, polling for a living, Carlin is an invaluable resource to the entire profession, having kind of chronicled this for 40 years. And just as another kind of quick note, the Wall Street Journal is now being done by Tony Fabrizio, who did Trump's work, John Anzalone, the Democrat who was the lead pollster for Biden, and I'm certainly enjoying their work and the good work they do. This is a classic off-year cycle, and we've seen these cycles before, whether it's for Republicans in 1994 or 2010 or 2014, or Democrats in 2006 or 2018. We are seeing everything lock into place for a wave election. The things that are locked into place are very low presidential approval, which we're going to talk about later, higher interest by the party out of power, which are Republicans, which we're watching, an issue agenda that's coalesced that is the most important things, the electorate that the incumbent party is getting very low ratings on, in this case, almost historically low. And what that means is we correctly, in our work, we show all registered voters. But all registered voters don't vote in a midterm. There's heavy self-selection. And so, like on our NBC, if you're tied with all registered voters, it really means that you're 3 or 5 points ahead as a Republican. And so, as somebody who runs campaigns, what I talk about is you can run cycles where you're on this even plane and it's a fair fight, and then you can run cycles where you're running uphill, where everything is weighted against you, and in this case, weighted against you as a Democrat by 3 to 5 points. And so it means that if the race is 50-50, you lose as a Democrat. I mean, you start losing close races. I don't disagree with what Mo is saying. We'll go into more detail. But the other thing we forget is like beyond the U.S. Senate, there's all these state ledge races. Yeah. There's all the local elections. Yeah. And so at the U.S. Senate level, you can have enough money and you can have candidate visibility and you can do all those things to be rowing against that tide. But you run national elections across the entire country at that margin. You wake up and the Democrats have lost 300 to 600 more legislative seats, and they've lost control of more legislatures, and you face a wave. I know Chris has been trying to get me here, but he tried to get me here in 2018 and in 2020, and I did the dishonorable thing and took a duck. So I'm not here as a partisan. I'm just showing up because it's a good cycle and it's a good time to be out in public. I would have said the same thing in 18, but I had the good sense to totally avoid being in public.
We appreciate your disclosure against interest. This is very good.
So after a very long career, you say if Bill McIntyre shows up, it's a good cycle for Republicans.
That's right.
That's already clear.
The midterm groundhog. We like that. That's good. Carlin, what do you think?
Well, I'm not in the prediction business and never have been, and I think I agree with everything that's been said thus far, but I'd like to say a word about election that's coming up even before Georgia, and that is the Australian election this Saturday, where they'll be using ranked choice voting. This is an election I've been following especially closely because in the last general election in Australia, in a country where everyone is required to vote, every single major pollster got the election wrong. Mm-hmm. And so this time we have another very close race. Looks like Labor has a slight edge. The same problem there, inflation and other things in Australia, but it will be a very fascinating thing to watch.
And if you do want to watch it, get up at 5 a.m. on Saturday
yes,
morning.
exactly.
Time difference is a problem here. So we're going to have a time here. I think those of you who've been in Election Watch know that we're going to try to focus on some key areas. First of all, I want to remind you, that those in the room, that we have a handout here which has key Senate and gubernatorial races, actually more comprehensively Senate and gubernatorial races. And we want to give thanks to Samantha Goldstein in particular for putting this together. You can refer to that. I'm going to start by saying something about the redistricting cycle, and then each of us are going to have some time to talk about other aspects of the election, things that they've been working on more recently. And redistricting, we can think about the beginning of the cycle. I think there have been a lot of waves back and forth of analyzing how redistricting is going to go, and depending on where you showed up in that time frame, you might have thought, well, Republicans are going to do better than Democrats, and wait a few months and things have changed. Republicans started out with an advantage of states that they controlled. There are many more states today that have independent or alternative modes of selecting, of drawing districts. But Republicans still did have an advantage, not as big as they had in the past cycle, but still they had an advantage. And that looked like that might help them. There was a period of time, though, where Democrats had a lot of good news. I will say one feature of this last election redistricting cycle is that the independent commissions moved strongly in the Democratic direction, or drew maps that were broadly favorable to Democrats, especially look at big states like California, where the ratio of Republicans to Democrats, the seats that are there, is similar to what's in Congress now, but it's still very different than it would be in a presidential election. So Democrats benefited from that. For a while, it looked like they were going to benefit from having some strong gerrymanders of their own, and they did have some that still lasted, although one of them especially has faded away in the last few weeks. And then, it looked like Democrats might actually have a 4 or 5 seat, maybe more advantage just from redistricting. Well, the tables turned again in the last 6 weeks or so with some big decisions, some in Ohio, in Florida with a new map, with the court in New York, and still not finalized in a couple places, looking like it might be slightly more favorable to Republicans now. So from a partisan standpoint, this is still not the biggest story, not the story that will control the outcome of the House, but if you wanted to say how things were tilted, I think we probably have a slight tilt towards Republicans from redistricting after all of these back and forth that we've seen in the last 9 months. A couple of other points. One is that we've had, over the years, a growing number of African-American members of Congress, the House of Representatives in particular. And those numbers have grown, but also the way in which African-Americans were elected has changed a bit. Yes, there are a significant number of majority-minority or near-majority-minority African-American districts that elect African-Americans, but African-Americans have been getting elected, mostly on the Democratic side, a few on the Republican side, in districts that are less black. And that has grown to a significant number of African-Americans in the House of Representatives. This cycle, we've seen, I think, from both sides, a willingness to sort of pull back from having very, very strongly African-American districts. On the Democratic side, they don't want their districts packed so much with voters, therefore hurting Democratic chances across the board and maybe hurting the number of African-American seats that you could create in the first place. And the courts also, and Republicans also feeling like we might step back a little bit from this. Overall, I think we did see a few places where Democratic African-American members will have a little bit of a harder time or may lose a seat here or there. But in general, I think we're going to see strong African-American membership in the next Congress. And especially interesting is that African-American Republicans are going to be much higher represented than they have been. Not large numbers, but I think there clearly will be 4 African-American Republicans. There may be up to 7, depending on some primaries and some general elections that come forward. And that I think is a significant development. We also have significant numbers of Hispanic majority-minority seats, which Republicans are likely to win in a number of those, and especially looking at South Texas. If I wanted to look at some very interesting races in South Texas at 3 seats, I think I would look at the possibility of Republicans doing extremely well along the border as they did in 2020. The idea that Republicans might benefit from redistricting a bit is not the same thing as how will Republicans do in the House. And I guess the simple point is these districts, Republicans are going to have a chance of winning districts that lean 5 or 6 points in the Democratic direction, maybe in a few cases some more. And therefore, they're going to have the opportunity to win many seats. I don't want to put a number on it, and maybe some others will be more specific than I will be. But certainly, the possibility of winning 30 seats, or perhaps more than that, is on the table for Republicans in a very good year. Only a little bit of that, I think, will be caused by the changes in redistricting. Most of that will be caused by the wave year that Bill was describing in his earlier comments. So I'm going to stop there on redistricting and go down the line to each of you and ask about something you've been working on recently and how it'll affect the election. And Carlin, I'm going to start with you. Carlin, as Bill mentioned, not only is an expert in public opinion, but is really an expert in digging into a comprehensive look at issues and polling questions. Really, literally, she has in her mind, in her files, every question that has been asked from the beginning on certain issues. And on our minds, with the recent Supreme Court leak of the Supreme Court draft opinion, is the issue of abortion and how that might affect the election. You've got a recent piece out on who's interested in abortion, but we also have a longer-term look at sort of the whole landscape of abortion and public opinion. What would you say the electorate, how the electorate might be affected by this new emphasis on this issue in a way that, and how will it play relative to all the other forces coming into play this cycle?
Well, let me touch on a few other issues before I get to that one. I want to take you back to '73, since I've watched polls for a long time. This was the first year that the Roper organization asked whether or not the country was headed on the right track or seriously off in the wrong direction. And that question is a hardy perennial of all of the polls in election years. And I think one thing that struck me recently about it is the very high level of wrong track consistently at a very high level. And I think that informs the election overall. Yesterday, we had 4 new polls, and this morning we've had a new one from NPR and PBS and Marist. And let me just talk about what are some of the interesting things in those polls overall. First of all of them showed that the economy was the top issue for voters. And the Reuters Ipsos poll yesterday, the economy was followed by immigration, crime, and the environment as the top issue of concern to voters. I think the first 3 are definitely strong negatives for the president. And I think that the environment, climate change is not necessarily a positive for the Democrats, in part because most of the public are passive environmentalists. But still, a lot of consistencies in these overall polls about the issue. Of course, inflation by far is the top issue in all of the polls, the top economic issue overall. And, excuse me, in Quinnipiac's question yesterday, 85% said that they expected a recession. And looking at last week's University of Michigan Index of Consumer Sentiment was down 9 percentage points. That's a pretty big drop over year. And what they said about the poll was that it was across all groups, across all demographic groups, just broad decline in overall concern, or in greater concern about inflation overall. While there's clearly a lot of blame to go around in the polls about what's causing inflation, this is Biden's watch, it's his responsibility, and there's no question that this is just a serious, serious problem for the administration, in part because Americans believe that administrations can do a lot about inflation. But even if inflation comes down, as I think the administration is hoping this summer, public opinion is usually a lagging indicator on this subject. So it's going to take a long time. And this is an area where we consistently see gender differences, where women are lagging indicators about the belief that something fundamental is changing. Immigration here, no good news for the Democrats. In the new AP Norc poll, people gave the Republicans a 16-point lead on handling border security. And in that poll, which was a really in-depth look at immigration, people were asked about the top priority in terms of immigration policy, and it was by far and away border security. COVID, again, receding as an issue. Only 9% see it as a serious concern, and about 75% now in most polls say it's manageable. Trust in the CDC and the feds still has not recovered from the drop that we saw across COVID. But the Biden administration has recovered. We don't know what will happen this fall, but again, negative indicators on federal government handling of the issue. Crime, in Gallup's latest poll last week, the percentage saying they worry a great deal about crime was the first time it had reached a very high level since 2016. So it's there. I like to think about issues in an election year as a stove with a bunch of issues on the front burner at a steady boil, and then a bunch of issues on the back burner at a steady simmer that could just rise at any time depending on what's going on. There's a fatalism in the public about guns. In the Economist YouGov question yesterday, a plurality, 44%, said that more gun control laws would not have stopped what happened in Buffalo, while 31% said it could have stopped the shooting. A quarter didn't know. The January 6th Commission, I think, is particularly interesting. Americans want the congressional investigation to continue, and there's slightly greater support, though, in most of the polls this spring for federal government investigation and not congressional investigation. And I think the reason that you see that is because the public in one of the polls yesterday was split 40-40 in terms of whether or not the Congressional Commission would be impartial and fair. Looking at abortion, I think one of the most difficult issues in public opinion. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one thing about the January 6th Commission. In that poll, nearly half, 49%, said that the issue would have absolutely no impact on their vote in the fall, the January 6th Commission. And then finally, a question that I wish Quinnipiac had repeated in the poll that came out yesterday. They asked a question earlier in the year about whether or not enough is already known about January 6th or whether the investigation should continue. And 48% of Democrats said enough was already known about January 6th. So again, just an interesting issue that's again on the back burner right now. The congressional hearings are coming up. We'll see what happens with that one. And finally, abortion. One of the most difficult issues, I think, in public opinion, because most people in their heart believe two fundamentally contradictory things, that it's murder and it should be a personal choice. Again, that's a very hard thing to resolve. In most cases, when people have deeply contradictory views on an issue, they pull away from the issue. They just don't want to be involved. They see no reason to resolve the contradictions in their own thinking. But when a decision like the one that leaked, or the leak came out a couple of weeks ago, that can change public opinion very dramatically. And there is an absolutely wonderful feature, Bill, in your new poll, in the charts that you sent out yesterday about what's happening. The last time, and you can say more about this, the last time NBC asked this question, the issue was a bit of a plus for the GOP, and Bill went down a list of all of the groups that said it was most important to them, and they're mostly GOP groups, and that's been true also in a question that Gallup has asked on a regular basis since 1996. And the Gallup question asks, is this issue the most important issue to you that you won't vote for anyone who doesn't agree with you? Is it just one of a number of important issues, or is it just not that important to you? And around 25 to 26% historically on that question have said that it's the most important issue to them in casting their vote. That's tilted ever so slightly Republican. That may no longer be the case. Gallup hasn't updated the question, but I think Bill has. And in the NPR poll, just hearing commentary on it this morning, I haven't had a chance to read it yet. They too suggested that the issue may have flipped in terms of intensity overall. People are still of two minds about abortion. They want to keep it legal. They don't want to see the decision overturned, but they're willing to put very significant restrictions on its use. And of course, that may end up playing out more in governor's races this fall than at the national level, but we will see.
Carlin, can I follow up with
Sure.
one question? So the unicorn this cycle, every cycle there is the fantasy voter, and it is, this time we've got women who are educated, suburbanites, affluent. These are Biden voters who may have voted. How about a Biden-Youngkin woman in Northern Virginia is the unicorn, riding a rainbow into the dreams of both parties' strategists. If we could just move those voters, then we can win the midterms.
Yeah.
I keep getting asked, and I have just evaded, is there a significant unit of voters? Is there a statistically worthwhile number of voters who are genuinely persuadable, genuinely movable voters for whom abortion or Roe would push them one way or the other? Are they there, or are we imagining this?
I don't know what that number is. And Bill, you may have some thoughts about it. Again, I'm watching that 20 to 26% number, the single issue voters on the issue overall. Right now, those women whom we're clearly watching on this cycle overall are pretty concerned about inflation. I just don't know what trumps what in the final, to use a expression, what trumps what by November.
Mm-hmm.
Carlin set this up to lead into Bill. Bill, of course, has a poll out recently, and I know you want to talk about that. So why don't you begin talking about that?
Well, we're talking about presidential approval and congressional preference. So Carlin helped set this up when she talked about that question about right direction, wrong track. We've been, in the NBC poll, we've been doing this for 34 years. And in 34 years, this is the fourth highest measure of people saying wrong track. The only three that are higher, well, four that were higher, were in 2008, in October, November, when we had Lehman and the collapse, and one time in 2011 where government got shut down and voters were really angry. So if you're at the fourth highest measure in 34 years, this is substantial for an incumbent party. And then let's look at the issue agenda, and this is the thing that's weighting down the president. People say the number one issue is the cost of living, and when asked the job approval for President Biden on cost of living, it's 21%, 23% approved, 22% approved, 71 disapprove. So if your number one issue is cost of living and the president is a 71% disapprove, and then we have a broader measure, the economy. The economy, the president's job approval is 33% and 66% disapprove. So the top two issues in the country are cost of living and the economy, and the president is starting with 66 and 71% disapprove. So the minute you hear that wrong track, the minute you hear those job approval scores, you can fill in the blank. And the fill in the blank is the president's job approval in our poll with adults was 39, average with the registered voters is in the low 40s. But midterm elections are, presidential elections, I say, are like putting your foot in the pedal, where you're hit what direction I want to go. A midterm election is put your foot in the brake, not that far, not that fast. And despite the conversations about former President Trump and his role in 2022, and now abortion and the Supreme Court decision, these are all important, but historically midterms have been a referendum on the party in power. And all of those things could not be more negative for President Biden. The other thing that's happening, Mo's going to talk about polarization. In this environment where both parties have went to their respective corners, and increasingly that's even harder, the president's approval with Democrats is down to 76%, and his approval amongst people who say they were Warren and Sanders supporters is down in the 60s. So the other thing that when we talk about deferential turnout is we're not Australia. We don't have to vote. So you can be a disaffected Democrat who's irritated that not enough's been done and sit home. And so the thing that's really striking is in our polls now, we wait, the more significant the trend, the more we wait for two polls in a row to do the same thing. In the NBC News poll, we've had now 2 polls in a row where the president's got net negative ratings among Hispanics in the country. For a party that's built on high levels of support from the Black community and the Latino community, that's huge. That is a problem. So congressional preference. So as I'm sort of building this wrong track presidential approval, since 1962, if your approval's below 49%, you lose an average of about 39 seats. I don't think I don't think Republicans might get that many because they're starting at 212 seats. Historically, when Republicans have won 40, 50, or 60 seats, it's because the starting point was so much lower. And we, in your redistricting conversation, the one thing that both parties agreed on was let's have even fewer competitive seats. That we took the number of truly competitive seats and reduced them. And so as a consequence of that, there just isn't all that much terrain. So between the Republican starting point and the fewer number of competitive seats, there's a cap on how many Republican seats you can gain. But talk about unicorns with everything we're watching. Unless there's something of such magnitude I could be forgiven here in November, like, oh, who knew that was going to happen? It is almost impossible to imagine how you don't make up 5 seats in the House. You don't have a House majority and a comfortable majority. On congressional preference, I mentioned it was tied. And this is where at NBC in 2006, right about now, I had to give a painful debrief where I explained the Republican coalitions collapsed in the congressional vote. Here are the markers. In 2010 at this time, I got the happier version of, it's been reassembled in 2018 around this time. Oops, Republican, the coalition has collapsed. And again, what's happened this cycle is the Republican coalition is reconnected earlier than I've seen it before, like in January or February. And so the markers of that, what are the markers of that? The markers of that is when men are voting more Republican than women are voting Democrat. And by the way, that gap between the genders, we know you've all heard about it forever. It's the biggest it's ever been in the Trump world, and it got bigger. But that's number one. Number two is independents voting Republican by double digits. And number three, the margins by which in this case, what's happened in the Republican Party are women with lower levels of education, white women with lower levels of education, going back and voting Republican by very wide margins. Abortion, and what's the impact of abortion in the cycle, which is sort of now the core question everyone's asked. First, I want to make absolutely sure that if something new happens that hasn't happened in 50 years, I don't work at a pay grade where I can tell you what's going to happen over 6 months. So I want to make sure the first thing you heard was not hubris, but real scared, like, hey, I don't know, it has never happened in 50 years.
Your disclaimer is noted.
Excuse me?
Your disclaimer is noted.
Okay, then I'm filling in some actual data now, Chris. Thank you. I guess. Thank you. So, but I'm saying here's what we know. Meaning, we were in the poll the first week after the leak, and so what do we know for sure? Well, we know for sure something really extraordinary, which is my friend Carlin has said truthfully. My 25 straight years is single issue abortion voters have been right of center Republicans who want less of it. That's 25 years of data, and in 1 week, it totally flipped. Yeah. It totally flipped to be core Democrat voters who say, I'm a single-issue abortion voter. But here's kind of the consequence. If you're already a core Democratic voter, whether your single issue is climate change or abortion, it doesn't really matter in the math because you were already overwhelmingly voting Democrat. Issues matter when they go from the core of each party to something in the middle. A new question we wrote, Carlin, that it was again Chuck Todd's and Mark Murray's idea. It was a good idea. We created a benchmark saying, in your state, do you think access to abortion is too easy, too difficult, or your state's found the right balance? Thank goodness we have that in a baseline before things change. But the baseline was like 16 or 18% too easy, 16 or 18% too difficult, about 25%, or 30%, it's the right balance, and 30% have no idea. But that baseline question is instantly, if the court rules the way that leak would suggest, that question will become the benchmark for people having attitudes about their own state, and that's where I get hard to predict. The press has correctly said in the NBC poll, wow, Democrat intensity went back up after that leak. That's true. It's an important finding. But still, Republicans have an 8-point edge on interest in the election. So that's better for the Democrats than the horrible numbers of January and March. But that 8-point margin is what the Democrats had in 2018 when they had their wave election. An 8-point intensity margin is still a big number for the out party. So that's, I think, just a little bit of overview of what we're seeing, and that's why I led off with, and last point, I get asked a lot about, hey, it's the social media, and it's only May or June, and things can change. And I hear that a lot. So far, it never happened. That the election environment sitting here in late May or June is the election environment in November. So in our new social media world, failing some massive event that none of us can predict, this is the inevitable environment the Democrats face.
Social media, just like real life, only more annoying.
Can I follow up on
Oh, yeah.
So Biden's numbers have been pretty bad for 6 or 7 months. His job approval rating has been kind of stuck in a bad place. But underlying that, the sort of some of the issues that his approval have changed. He's doing better on COVID. Even the war in Ukraine is sort of has some positive numbers. Inflation wasn't on people's minds as much 7 months ago as it is today. Now it's another number, but those numbers have remained steady. So how do you think about these issue numbers, the approval on issue numbers, versus this top line number that has remained steady? What's driving that? Is there sort of a big unsettledness in the country that drives this, or what's
Actually, I think that's a really easy question. The easy question is what Mo's going to talk about. We're a core partisan party. So I'm saying at 76, below 75%, that's an enormous warning sign, but you can't get lower than that. Yeah. He's a decent, nice man. He's a core Democrat, and he's trying, and he's their guy. So that's 75%. So 75% of 40%, 5% of Republicans, and then independents, you get in the 30s. You structurally that puts you around 40%. And that's why Donald Trump was at his worst somewhere around 40%, because the math worked in the opposite direction. So given the strength of partisanship in this country, it's really hard to get below around this 40%, but that's why it doesn't change. Because that sort of structure of opinion has been stuck in place. And so again, failing a huge event that the president messes up, which we don't want to have, because I'm talking about things of such magnitude no one here wants them to happen. It's hard for me to imagine his dropping lower. And it's also easy to imagine, look, he can drift up. But Gallup has wonderful data from like January to June to the election. There's no precedent of a president going up in a midterm by more than a couple of points. Trump did, but because he went from 40 to 45. So as the election narrows and comes closer and the Democrats are running, hundreds of millions of dollars of media, I think the president's job approval will go up because the Democrats will come back, and then he'll get up to the low to mid 40s. It's just that low to mid 40s means you still get crunched in terms of electoral result. But saying that today with that issue cluster, the president's going to have independents move to majority approval and transform these numbers to get the president to high 40 or 50, failing this unknown massive event that none of us want to have happen, who knows? We're all right to say be cautious in today's era. Nothing like that has ever happened in a midterm election since the 1962. And I don't see how it could happen for President Biden. That's why I think this is sort of locked in terms of the election environment.
Let me follow up with just one thing you talked about abortion and moving up the issue stack for Democrats. If I'm Tim Ryan in Ohio, or if I'm Mark Kelly in Arizona, if I'm presenting as a moderate Democrat in a Republican-leaning state, I'm thinking this decision or the prospect of this decision will help me keep my party in line, right? Because as you said, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice, right? For all the Democrats who say, I don't like Biden, they're not doing enough on inflation, they're not doing enough on the issues I care about, I'm gonna stay home. Does this raise the ante for Democrats and their engagement for candidates who they might otherwise shun as being excessively moderate?
That's a possibility. The other possibility is, the other thing that happened to the president is in 2021, we had the Afghanistan withdrawal, which did not look good and go well. But then we had what looks like months and months and months of Democrats fighting with each other and not getting anything done. So the other possibility, we had an abortion vote in the Senate, and it was 51 opposed, because of Manchin's vote. So the other possibility, and what the Democrats might face, is a lot of people saying, even for something as fundamental as this, they can't get anything done. And we don't know, it could end up turning people off. So this is why, thank you, you carefully noted, same thing. If I can talk confidently about years of data we've seen in the stuff I've done. If you've not seen it in 50 years, there's a whole range of options, but I think inside Washington, the range of options seems to be pretty narrow in the coverage, which is, oh my gosh, this is going to be the mobilizing event that's going to transform the midterm election and change that voter. I don't know if they've thought about, actually, I wonder if one of the other options could be, it's one more thing that convinces people the Democrat majority in the House and Senate can't get stuff done and is a turnoff. And as I said, the other unknown is whether this issue, and it is certainly fundamental and important, whether this issue breaks out of being only a core Democrat vote issue into something that affects a lot more swing voters. Carlin's already hinted that she's kind of, if you're a lot of these vote comes down to a lot of working women with less than a college degree. The conflict between their terrible economic numbers and this issue, we've never seen them have to make that choice about what's more important. And that's again something I want to be cautious about, but I just want to say, please don't underestimate the horrible anchor those women and their economic views about the cost of living, the economy, and their ability to want to go express their unhappiness about those numbers and what they want to see get done.
So Mo, we're going to turn to you, and I know I'll mention Georgetown again because I'm also an alum. So you have a relatively recent Georgetown politics poll on civility. I know you want to talk about that, and maybe some other things. So Mo.
Yeah. So look, I'm not a pollster, so I'm a little intimidated sitting on the stage right now, but I spent an entire career making decisions based on what pollsters told me. And I think back to 2020, and I'm not going to try to compare this year to a presidential year. But what I found fascinating, right, was the right track, wrong track number was at a historic low, right? Wrong track was one of the highest on record heading into the 2020 election. Donald Trump had remarkably low approval ratings heading into the 2020 election. And he got more votes than he did the first time, right? He got the second highest number of votes of anybody who ever ran for president, right behind Joe Biden. And so when you've got that kind of scenario, next question, why, right? And I think a lot of it has to do with the polarization in this country. There's very little I'm going to disagree with that's already been said. But we've been trying to dive into that a little bit at Georgetown. Our polling is conducted by two other legendary pollsters, Ed Goaz, a Republican, and Celinda Lake, a Democrat. And over the past few years, we've been trying to track this idea started as an idea about, well, what do people think about civility in politics? But it's really broadened to just polarization in politics. And we want to know three things. How bad do they think it is? Who do they blame? Do they want it? Right, so how bad is it? Pretty bad. On a scale of 0 to 100, 0 being no division at all and 100 being edge of civil war, we've consistently seen a mean response in the low to mid 70s. Right, people believe we are nearly 3/4 of the way to civil war. And that's one of the few things that unites voters. Right? That cuts across party lines. Who do they blame? Everybody actually kind of blames everybody, including their own team, though they blame the other team more. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. But it's the third question that really fascinates me, because I think it helps explain why you see politics the way it is right now. Do you really want it? So if you ask the question, do you want more civility in our politics? Like 93% say yes, right? There's 7% of the country believes our politics are too civil, but that's about as close to universal as you get. But start asking the question a little bit differently. Agree or disagree with the following statement. Common ground and compromise are noble goals you want our leaders to aspire to. Roughly 78% of people say they agree with that. Common ground and compromise. Makes sense? Lord knows the number of TV scripts I've written over the years where we talk about our ability to work together, right? 78% say common ground and compromise is a noble goal. Very next question, agree or disagree? I'm tired of leaders who compromise on my values. I want them to stand up and fight the other side. 74% say they agree with that. Right? It's as if people are saying, no, I absolutely go find common ground. As soon as you come to where I'm standing, we'll be on common ground. And that's a tough line for political leaders to walk. One other question I want to amplify, and then I'll start to talk about how I see it playing out in the election. We asked people in our most recent poll, what values do you wish you could see in political leaders? And we gave them a list of like 10, but 3 jumped out. Freedom, responsibility, and respect. In that order, freedom was the single greatest, followed by responsibility, followed by respect. When we took a look at the partisan breakdown, though, so much of our current debate makes sense. Freedom was number one, in part because of that was nearly universally selected by Republicans. Democrats were a little bit more split. They came in first with responsibility, second with respect. And independents were split, with freedom coming out on top, followed closely by responsibility. And I saw that and I was like, well, the whole argument and debate and fight we've been having over all the COVID mandates makes a lot more sense now with the way it's playing out.
It's like rock, paper, scissors.
Right, yeah, exactly. So looking at these midterms and what could happen, again, I will never say what's likely to happen, but what could happen, and listening to everything that everyone else has talked about so far, I go back to what I said earlier, right? I think you could see a wave in the House, and I 100% agree with Bill, everything down ballot. Because the way our districts are drawn, the way politics works at the district and local level, it can't really go any other way. We are picking a jersey and sticking to that jersey. And when you get down to the congressional level and below, that's animating a lot of it. But it is this polarization that I think keeps the Senate very much in play. I agree that the single greatest animating decision is going to be inflation. Every time you talk to a voter about any other issue, they may engage with you for a little bit, and then they're like, yeah, but what about cost of gas and cost of milk? And that's true across the board. And I also agree that the enthusiasm gap should be setting up a lot of red flags. Because if you buy into this notion that the polarization is setting the table, right? There aren't as many crossover. I mean, yes, the Biden-Youngkin voter is the unicorn, but that's a very narrow constituency.
There are not very many unicorns.
Right? There aren't very many unicorns. You're walking into an election where the table is already set to some extent. But the enthusiasm gap is pretty low. And so what should Democrats do? Well, they should fix inflation, or at least give voters the impression, the belief that they're at least on top of it, that they're at least working on it. As Carlin said, like, people believe administrations can do something about it. The reality is more complicated. So what does someone like me do, right? The hacks? Knowing that me sitting in campaign headquarters somewhere can't wave a magic wand to make inflation go away, I'm going to start tackling that enthusiasm gap. And that's where I think you see Democrats go. That was the old me who would do that. The new me, who fears more for the future of democracy and the republic, thinks that's a terrible approach, but that is what campaign operatives do because it's an effective approach to winning elections. And so there's going to be a lot of unknowns. There's going to be a lot of things that I think will influence that. One, we talked about it already a little bit. I agree that the unicorns, that these primarily suburban moms care more about the cost of milk and gas. As Glenn Youngkin showed us, they care about what's happening in their kids' schools. But will Roe give them something else to care about? Or what about, I also agree with what Bill said, that if you are a single issue Democrat, you're already voting Democrat with one addition, if you're voting, right? So for those disaffected Democrats, those Democrats who are feeling dejected and disappointed and frustrated and exhausted and can't feel animated, does this or something else reanimate that? There's two emotions in my experience. Every single one of us in this room, our political activity is motivated by one of two things, one of two emotions: fear and anger, or hope and optimism. Right? Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, they were hope and optimism candidates. Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders were more fear and anger candidates. But fear and anger is easier to motivate as a campaign than hope and optimism is. So do you see these disaffected Democratic women who are staying home suddenly start to get even more fearful for something else? Where could that play out? In places like Arizona, in places like Georgia, where you've got incredibly competitive Senate races, where you've got Republican legislatures and governors who have signaled that once this ruling comes down, they may start moving. Does that change the conversation just enough so that it's not just about the cost of gas and milk, but something else that could motivate, that could elevate the fear and anger of some people, of some of these voters? So that's question number one. Question number two for me is Donald Trump. I think we have seen that Donald Trump's popularity or unpopularity are not necessarily transferable down ballot, except when Republicans are the ones who are doing it themselves, right? Glenn Youngkin was able, no matter how hard my good friend Terry McAuliffe tried to make Glenn Youngkin mini Trump, Youngkin kept him at arm's length. Trump behaved, stayed out of the state. And so it allowed Youngkin to not let the conversation get changed from what he wanted it to be. That was a smart, effective, healthy strategy. But what happens in states where Trumpism is actually going to be on the ballot? What happens in states like Ohio? In a state like Georgia? Depending on how the next couple of days go, maybe a state like Pennsylvania, where Trumpy candidates are getting nominated, the former president is going to want a campaign. He's not going to be silent much longer in some of these places. And he comes in. Does that change the conversation again, just enough? Do people who voted for Joe Biden out of exhaustion over chaos, who may not be happy with the performance of the Democrats up till now, but suddenly get that chaos of the previous 4 years thrown in their faces again? What does that do? Could do one of two things. It could animate some more disaffected Democrats, or it could just make a whole lot of people so exhausted they throw up their hands and stay home. I don't know what happens. But I think in the places, in the states where Trumpism is back on the ballot, there is the potential that the conversation changes just enough at the margins to maybe have an impact on the race. None of this is to say that inflation and exhaustion over inflation is not going to be the dominant conversation. But given how polarized we are, given how people are so sort of focused on their corner and their team, some of these other things could change the conversation enough that in a close Senate race, 1 or 2 points could make all the difference in the world. So I'll pause there.
Okay, go ahead.
I want to turn to Chris. We have a last round of this round here.
Yes.
But let me do two quick setups. So I know you want to talk some about state legislative races and governors, and I'm just going to remind you again of the handout for those in the room. We have the gubernatorial races on one side of the sheet. And then also remind you, because we'll be moving to another section shortly, about questions. Again, those in the room will have a mic, and those out there, you can email samantha.goldstein@aei.org or with Twitter with the hashtag AEI Election Watch. So Chris.
Mo, I think you need the, I'm going to call it the McInturf Godzilla rule, the massive change not seen in 50 years to come in. I think you should be hoping for a little Godzilla action this year to change the discussion, right?
Yeah, look, I think, something big, you don't know what you don't know, right? Something big happens that we don't see coming that could completely change the entire political environment. But I also think, and I think the table is very much set, but I do think that in statewide races in particular, campaigns have become so good at using technology and using big data to better find their people, right? That's why the cost of mobilization is cheaper than the cost of persuasion. And now they can do it much more effectively. Donald Trump and the RNC in 2016, more than the Trump campaign, proved that by finding disaffected Republicans and dragging them out. And that kind of thing can be good for a point or two. So yeah, Godzilla would be great, but in the absence of Godzilla, you've got a bunch of smart Democrats with some scalpels, right, trying to go in with precision to find some voters that might be animated by some of these other issues. Is it a Hail Mary? I don't know, but could it have some impact? Maybe.
Okay, so Bill mentioned how the lower cap on Republican hopes for gains in the House. And part of that is because they ate dessert first in 2020. So in 2020, Joe Biden had reverse coattails. There were no Democratic gains in the House. Republicans actually gained seats. They flipped seats. So basically, what we know from history is it goes like this. In a quadrennial election, the winning team wins in districts where they shouldn't win, right? They pick up some stuff that normally they wouldn't win, and then they give them back in the next midterm. But the Democrats didn't have that, right? It went the other way. But an even better indicator on this stuff, if you want to know how it goes, is to go look at the governorships and go down into the state houses. And most notably, in 2020, the Democrats did not switch one. They did not switch one state house in a year where Joe Biden won by how many million votes nationally?
7.
So he wins by 7 million votes nationally, and Democrats can't flip a chamber of a state house, right? This tells you about some elasticity problems that Democrats have.
Didn't we lose a couple? We lost at least one.
Yeah, so that is about where it is. So Republicans starting in 2010 in a really intentional way have focused on the project of state houses. And really, after Obama's win, they really got serious. Ed Gillespie started, but Republicans got really serious about, let's make this happen. Because Democrats had enjoyed some advantages historically. And Republicans were very successful. And then Democrats saw that this was a fact going into redistricting. Oh no. And former Attorney General Eric Holder, and he drafted former President Obama to join him in this, to say, come on, Democrats, we've really got engaged. We got to get engaged on this. It affects redistricting. It affects everything. And in 2020, they whiffed. So the danger for Democrats in this cycle is, in what is shaping up to be a very difficult cycle for Democrats, Republicans are poised to make gains on the gubernatorial and on the state house level. And it's never too soon to be thinking about 2030 redistricting. Why wait, right, John? Why would we wait? Let's start now. So just to give you a little overview of where we are. Governors, 28 Republicans nationally, 22 Democrats. There'll be 36 governors on the ballot. As John says, you can refer to your handy dandy sheet. 20 Republicans are up, 16 Democrats are up. So the map is a little better for Democrats. The climate is better for governorships. The climate is better for Republicans. The map's a little better for Democrats. Democrats are defending one governorship in a state that Trump won, which is Kansas. Looks like it'll be a pretty rough sledding out there. Republicans are defending 6 governorships in states that Biden won. Arizona, sorry, Democrats. Georgia, tough. Maryland, they'll probably, one would think that will come home for them. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont. So Vermont is weird for a lot of reasons that I won't get into, and it has to do with things other than legal drugs and fish. They have a Republican governor. It's complicated. But in Maryland, a thing to think about is Maryland and Massachusetts have had popular Republican governors for quite a while now. Larry Hogan's one of the most popular governors in the country. But they were put in as correctives to what was perceived as excesses in one-party Democratic rule in these states. And you don't see that continuing. 8 sitting governors, 5 Republicans and 3 Democrats will not seek re-election, and all but one, Charlie Baker, was prevented from running for re-election due to term limits. Republicans have 23 trifectas, which is to say in 23 states, Republicans have the governorship and both houses of the legislature. Democrats have only 14, and 13 states have divided government. 88 of the country's 99 state legislative chambers, Nebraska with its unicameral always has to screw everything up. 88 of the 89 state legislative chambers will hold regularly scheduled elections. Elections in those 88 chambers represent 6,166 of the country's 7,383 state legislatures. That's 84%. Thank you, Samantha Goldstein, for that level of specificity. Republicans control 54% of all state legislative seats. 54%. So the Republicans, even after losing the presidency, and even after a difficult year, 54%. Republicans hold a majority in 62 chambers to 36 for Democrats. And number of legislators have changed hands. In 2010, 20 state legislatures changed hands from D to R. So that's what we're talking about. The Republicans got serious in 2010 about it. They focused on it. They put money in it. They put resources. They put attention into something that mostly they had neglected, and got 20. In 2014, 11 chambers flipped to Republican control. And in 2018, only 6 switched from R to D. So in a good Democratic year, they only got 6 of those back. So just as a context to think about this stuff, this is your best measure of real intensity, right? I can lie to Bill, right? And how interested are you in voting? And I can say, oh, I'm a very concerned citizen. I'm very, very interested in voting. But if you can get somebody not just to go out and vote, but go all the way down the ballot, punch all the little holes, check all the little things, and go down and do all this stuff, and you have to then go in states where you don't have a hot race, right? If you're in Kansas this year, there isn't a big nationalized Senate race that is going to talk about this stuff. You got to go vote for the governor, right? Which is boring, important and boring. And not just because it's Kansas, but this is how you can see the movement of direction in parties. And over time, what I have observed is that Republicans who were previously, they would show up in a wave, they'd show up in a big number to go vote for Ronald Reagan, or they'd go show up in large numbers, but then pulled back from the day-to-day grind of politics in a lot of places because they don't like or generally they were conservative, didn't like the government, didn't like to be engaged in politics. It wasn't their priority. Republicans have, over the past decade, really gotten into politics, right? They have really gotten into politics and government in a way that they weren't before. And these numbers are a reflection of the depth of that intensity, not just in this cycle, but over time. To reiterate John's excellent point, we're going to go to audience questions here in a minute. You can email samantha.goldstein@aei.org, or you can, but never tweet. But if you had to, hashtag AEI Election Watch, never tweet. And in the room, we have a microphone, so be thinking of your erudite, lovely question that you want to ask our august panel. But before we get to that, I want to ask our panelists, is there anything you want to ask each other? Is there anything you guys want to talk about? Is there something that you think, other than the Australian elections? That was your cagiest move yet, Carlin.
Yeah, I thought so.
How's the didgeridoo vote coming in? But do you guys have anything you guys want to talk about before we turn it over to the people?
I have one question about something in Bill's poll this time, and it was the same pattern that we saw in the ABC News Post poll about a week earlier. 55%, I think, in your poll wanted Trump to be the leader of the Republican Party, but in your other wonderful question that has a long trend that asks whether or not you're more of a supporter of the Republican Party or more of a supporter of Donald Trump, you had a new low, I think 34% of people saying that they were a supporter of Donald Trump. There seems to be a tension there, same pattern in the Washington Post poll. What do you think that tension means?
I don't know for sure.
Oh, okay. I couldn't figure it out either.
But I would say, as somebody who is involved in Republican primaries, Donald Trump is the leader of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
His endorsement has consequence and significant consequence on numbers. And he is the likely front runner should he run in 2024. So on that question about do I identify more with Trump, do I identify more with the Republican Party, there's been a shift. But those things I've just said describing the former president's impact on the party is very much our experience as we look at these primaries and do data about these primaries in 2022. So I think, my thinking is that question that says a majority are saying he's the person, the leader of the party, is the more reflective of what is his actual consequence and clout at the moment. Okay. And it should be the one that, to me, has more weight.
Okay. I was just going to say, there's one more issue we haven't talked about yet, but I think could, I'll be watching to see if it has any impact, again, through the lens of polarization. And that's the issue, that's the discussion about elections, right? I mean, the basiest of the base voters on each side are incredibly animated. Republicans, over the issue of election fraud, Democrats over the issue of election suppression. And for the first time in a long time, the conversation feels very real to a lot of those people. It's not just this, this concept. It's real, and you see it playing out in state legislatures, Democrats freaking out over that, Republicans, again, still seething, core base Republicans still seething over the fraud they are convinced happened in 2000. Whether or not, how that plays into the conversation in the coming months, I think is also could be another mobilizing factor for both sides.
Oz and McCormick are learning a lot about how good Pennsylvania's electoral system is these days. They're finding all about that.
Yeah. I have one very quick question, and I want to get to your question, and that is, so we've seen in the last two elections, midterm and the presidential, the highest turnout, both the midterm and the highest turnout in a presidential election in modern history. And broadly speaking, it's the presidential turnout we've seen been very good the 4 cycles before that. Really, it looks a lot better than it did 20, 30 years ago. So midterm elections turnout is harder to predict because you've got some states playing and some states not. But what's your sense of the fall election for turnout? Or is this an intense turnout election, or are we going to drop back from where we've been?
It's going to be high. This is the thing that snapped into place after this leak on the abortion where the Democrats re-engaging. But here's the other thing we need to remember is money and tactics matter. Most talked well about what people who run campaigns for a living. If you give smart people this much money and this much advance notice and you need to turn out, we shouldn't so the reason the election interest will be high is the nice thing about our country is that still when wrong track is this high, angry people go vote because they're ticked off. And I don't worry about our country until that's the reverse. It'll really upset people, stop voting. But secondly, you have that dynamic. You've got the intensity issues we're talking about, and Mo spoke well about the ballot stuff. But third, we should not underestimate the massive, massive amount of money and what happens when smart people are given massive money and this much notice. And it impacts turnout. So I don't know if it'll be quite as high as 2018. We're not seeing that yet. But 2018 and 2020 were so extraordinary that no one here should be disappointed if you read the headline, oh, turnout drops compared to 2018. Okay, but it's still massive compared to 2014, 2010, or other cycles. That's at the moment where what I think is likely, and the headline is going to miss the story of what happened in 2022 in terms of turnout.
The press always likes to talk about the ad war between the two candidates, the two parties. The far more important war that no one sees is the data war between the two parties. Both parties are dumping a ton of money in an escalating battle to perfect their voter files and the data that they use to do their targeting. And so you give smart people a lot of money, great data, improving data, and a scalpel, and they can get incredibly precise in targeting messaging to each one of you about why this election is so important for you specifically to vote. I think it's going to be hard to.
Our condolences in advance to all swing state residents who will be attacked in every room of your house when your smart refrigerator tells you, think about how much arugula costs, blame Joe Biden. Are we ready for some questions?
Yep.
Oh, we got hands shooting up. Okay, in the back, sir. Yes, sir. Microphone coming to you.
Hi, I'm Bill Arnone with the National Academy of Social Insurance. We're nonpartisan, non-political, but in full disclosure, my non-academy life, I've been very involved in Democratic politics, including Hillary Clinton's campaign. It's good to see you, Mo. Why do you think neither party focuses on either Social Security or Medicare as campaign issues? Older voters are always voters. Or does it take a or incumbent non-running for election like Rick Scott to dare even talk about those issues?
Carlin, you know what people think about this.
I think until people perceive it being in danger, and I'm not sure that they're paying attention to the reports, they just don't get engaged. I mean, if you think back to '83, before the Greenspan Commission, I'd have to look back at the numbers. I don't remember them, but I think you had a lot more engagement and concern about the issue.
And I think once Donald Trump said in 2016 that was off the table for Republicans and shot Paul Ryan out of a cannon, I think that issue was done for the foreseeable future. Ma'am. Here comes the microphone.
Almost there. Right there.
Both Carlin and Bill were asked about polling question on abortion. The polling question was not, do you believe that a woman should have the freedom to make her reproductive choices? So my question is actually to Mo. So has the Democratic Party failed in not properly describing the freedoms that Democrats believe are important? Freedom of choice, freedom to select your partner, freedom to not have your vote suppressed, versus freedom to refuse a shot, freedom to not wear a mask. Has that been a failure of the Democratic Party to not clearly state the things that are important in terms of freedoms?
So you actually, when I hear your question, I actually hear two different questions and two different points. And I'm probably not going to sufficiently or satisfactorily answer either one. But look, on the issue of choice and abortion, I think the messaging of the Democratic Party actually reflects where a majority of Democrats are. I think a majority of Democratic voters believe that in a woman having the ability to make her own choices, but a majority of Democratic voters also support some level of restriction. So I think the messaging of the Democratic Party I think if you believe that the polling reflects a majority of the voters, that's the Democratic Party's messaging. I don't know that you could say it was a failure. But the second part of your question is one that's really fascinating to me and I think about a lot. And that's Democrats reclaiming what freedom means. Because right now, it goes back to the question I mentioned in our poll about what value people are looking for. And freedom wins, right? Followed by responsibility. Freedom wins. But Democrats have ceded that conversation to Republicans, right? We have allowed Republicans to own freedom, and so we'll just own responsibility and appeal to people's better angels. And I'm all for responsibility. I'm all for a sense of community. Our sense of community is a little out of whack right now. What does it even mean to be in community? The Pete Buttigieg talks about this sometimes, about how throughout our history, when there was crisis, we all came running together, right? There was a fire at the barn and the whole town would come out and form the water brigade. But in this most recent crisis of COVID, we were told to stay away from one another, right? Our whole sense of community is out of whack. And so while I'm all for responsibility, like I don't want to cede freedom. I'm a Democrat. I believe in freedom. And so I think where Democratic messaging needs to improve is making the case as to what freedom means to us and making that case. And you did a good job of articulating some of it, right? The freedom to be who you want to be, the freedom to love who you want to love, the freedom to do what you want to do, make your own healthcare decisions, the freedom. Those are all Democrats can do a better job of reclaiming it so that we're not just ceding it to the Republicans.
Who else has a great question? Are we going to have to? Oh, here we go. Thanks. Keep sparing us from Twitter. Please do your part to defeat Twitter here today.
Hi, my name's Onda. I have 4 very quick questions, and you can sort of, they're all very quick.
Each with 3 parts.
You could ignore some of them if you want. Bill had mentioned 1962, and Ukraine came up very briefly. I'm wondering if that could, if Vladimir Putin did something really crazy on November 1, like that could really shift things. So I'm wondering if you guys are thinking about that. For abortion, I'm wondering, are some of the polls getting some nuance as to, say, where Democrats stand as far as like what week they would want to see abortion cut off? So right now it's about 23 weeks. And my understanding is the United States is extremely progressive and that that's the cutoff, whereas other countries maybe 20 weeks. So if Democratic voters are not so concerned, if it's 23 weeks versus 16, well, Republicans can kind of roll these numbers back and maybe Dems are not going to be so upset. Predict it and prediction markets. So Carlin had mentioned Australia, or 2020 with Trump, at least in 2020 with Trump, the prediction markets seem to be capturing something that the pollsters were not capturing. And then finally, I'm just wondering if there's a rule of thumb for how much money matters as far as tilting elections. Because I've heard it doesn't really matter or it does matter.
What's your name? We may want to book you for the next panel.
Okay. Can we get, maybe Bill, can you take the 1962 question, and Carlin, if you want to say something about the nuance in abortion, and
Right.
we'll figure out the rest.
Well,
Get to all
Ukraine,
4.
I have a good rule of thumb. Americans, foreign policy matters when American lives are lost. So there was, of course, empathy and some impact on our first poll in March saying that it was an important issue, but it dropped 16 points between March and May. So unless American lives are lost, or I suppose in your, the use of a nuclear or chemical weapon or something, I don't see it as having that much impact. So I think that one I could handle pretty quickly.
A quarter of Americans are worried about Russia launching a nuclear or chemical attack. That's a pretty low number in terms of things, at least right now. The prediction markets, it seems to me, at least right now, are very lightly traded, and I think that's a problem with them at this point in the cycle. And abortion, I'm skeptical of all the weeks questions because, gosh, you have to sort of think about, well, what does that mean? Is it a trimester? So I just personally don't look at those questions, though a lot of them are being asked.
And the thing about prediction markets, I would just say, polls help drive prediction markets, right? So the people who are betting their money, obviously, we know if real money is involved, then there is real interest in that they're putting their money where their mouth is. But those people don't have special inputs, right? They just they're reading Bill's poll, they're looking at the stuff that's out there, and they're making decisions in the same way that other markets are driven. And one thing we have to remember about prediction markets is it's not what's going to happen, it's what people think is going to happen. And so there's a sort of an echo chamber effect that takes place there.
And I want to see if Mo wants to weigh in, but I'll very quickly on the money issue, and there's more complication than this, but for a long time, I think we've known that raising a good amount of money is important, getting to a threshold to be able to run a serious campaign. But beyond that, the person with the most money doesn't always win. I think also the point about more money being put in on both sides for turnout is also a fair point, but it's not one that necessarily would swing the day. Mo, do you want to, on any of these?
I totally agree with your point on money. I would say, sadly, celebrity is more important than money in some cases. Look, one of the biggest challenges we have with money, in my opinion, right now, it's not, I have a big problem with dark money. I have a big problem with the lack of transparency. But for so long, we've talked about the impact of big money on politics. I think the impact of small money on politics is bigger and maybe even more dangerous right now. Right? When Marjorie Taylor Greene can go out and say the most insanely crazy things in the world and get stripped of her committee assignments and censured even by her own party leadership or whatever, and then put out a fundraising email and raise $3 million in a couple of days in $25 increments, right? That's a problem.
But your challenger also tends to be able to go out and do that too.
But to some extent, right? Yeah, and none of it's coming from in-state, right? None of the money that they're getting is coming from in-state. So the race, she has celebrity. The race has celebrity. What happens in these, state legislative races in Kansas where you don't have that kind of attention, you don't have that kind of celebrity, you don't have that kind of engagement, then you got to do the long, hard slog of fundraising the way we used to do it, and you do have to hit a threshold in order to run a credible campaign. You don't need the most, but you got to hit a threshold.
There's only two kinds of money, enough and not enough. And once you have enough, you can have 100 times enough, and you get to a point of supersaturation. And the other thing I would say, just to add on to what Mo said, you look at somebody like Madison Cawthorn. Now, that's a very sad story about a obviously very troubled young man. But man, they could scrape those lists, and they could get those small dollar donations down into a district that will never be competitive, that is as Republican as Ronald Reagan's socks, right? It's just as Republican as it could possibly be, and it will never change, but they can scrape in a bunch of money, and then a bunch of consultants and flim-flam guys will go in. Democrats will waste enough money to burn a wet elephant in Kentucky this year, trying to challenge Rand Paul, because they will do a bunch of online solicitations. Democrat, don't you hate Rand Paul? Yes, I do. Okay, give me $5. Click. It'll be better work effect. So just bearing that in mind.
To burn a wet elephant?
You take a lot of money to burn a wet elephant, Mo.
That's a new one. I like that one.
So we are unfortunately reaching the end of our program. I'm going to thank Carlin, Bill, and Mo for joining us here. It's been everything we've expected and more. And then I'm going to turn to Chris for one last goodbye and for an informational message about the future.
Well, the first thing I want to say is what a privilege for me. Never thought I'd get to be on a stage with people, including my colleague, John, and Carlin, but Bill and Mo. Well, Mo and I have been on television together, so this was a reunion, but what a privilege to get to be, for me, a simple country pundit to get to be with some people like those three brainiacs down there. So that's a real treat. Thank you, guys. And thank you all for watching. And I would tell you, our next in-person event will feature a delicious lunch. Oh, yes. Right here at AEI on Wednesday, October 26th. Wow. Wednesday, October 26th. Please join us. It will be fun, it will be interesting, and it will be good. We'll see you then.
And it'll be about
We're probably the election. We'll probably stick with the election.
Do you know what you're serving for lunch yet?
Nice to meet you in person.